Good evening to everyone, and welcome to session 4 of the online symposium, Plague Literature in the Time of Coronavirus. Tonight's session is titled, You Couldn't Make This Up, Fictionalized Accounts of Plague. So tonight we will be discussing selections from 2 American novels, Arthur Mervyn by Charles Brockden Brown, published in 1799, and Look Homeward Angel, A Story of the Buried Life by Thomas Wolfe, published in 1929. So my name is Vivian Cow. I am Assistant Professor of Composition in the Humanities Department at Lawrence Technological University. I coordinate the first year composition program there, and I also teach various writing courses. Soon I will be teaching literature courses as well in the core curriculum and in our department's newest major, the Bachelor of Science in Technological Humanities. I am delighted to be joined tonight by my 2 fellow commentators, Dr. Paula Eckhart and Dr. Natalie Zaczek. Paula Eckhart, I'll just introduce both of them briefly before I begin. Paula Eckhart is professor and chair of the Department of English at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where she teaches 20th century American literature and Southern literature. She is also the editor of the Thomas Wolfe Review and a past president of the Thomas Wolfe Society. Her books include Maternal Body and Voice in Toni Morrison, Bobby Ann Mason, and Lee Smith from 2002, and Thomas Wolfe and Lost Children in Southern Literature from 2016. Earlier in her professional career, Paula worked as a registered nurse and certified childbirth educator, and her current interests include representations of health, illness, and the body in literature, and particularly in the works of Thomas Wolfe. Natalie Zaczek is senior lecturer in American Studies at the University of Manchester. She teaches and researches in colonial and antebellum American history, as well as on the history of the Caribbean, race, slavery, and gender. Her first book, Settler Society in the English Leeward Islands, 1670 to 1776, won the Royal Historical Society's Gladstone Prize, and she is now finishing a new book manuscript on horse racing in the 19th century United States. So before we begin with our discussion of Arthur Mervyn and Look Homeward Angel, I want first to remind everyone to tune in next Friday, same time, same place, to session 5 of the Plague Lit Symposium, and that is titled Eros, Healthy and Diseased. And the panelists, Paul Josson, Omar Vargas, Phil Vogt, and Michael Goyette will be discussing Plato Symposium and Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So please do join us for that. Also, Phil wanted me to mention that he is going to be a sort of shadowy figure with us tonight. He's definitely here with us, but he will be popping in and out to let us know when people want to speak or when there's a question asked. So for the audience, if you have a question or a comment, please submit your questions through the Q&A function, or you can also indicate through the Q&A function that you would like to speak to us audibly, and then you will be patched in and you can ask your question or give us your comment and join us in our discussion. All right, so to start us off tonight, Paula and Natalie have both graciously agreed to provide a brief historical overview of the novels and also some important cultural and plot-focused context for our discussion. We will be talking mostly about passages from both novels that have to do especially with pandemic and illness. The 1793 yellow fever pandemic in Philadelphia for Arthur Mervyn, and the 1918 flu for Look Homeward Angel. So since Arthur Mervyn comes first chronologically as far as publication date goes, I'll ask Natalie to start us off by introducing Arthur Mervyn, and then Paula will introduce Look Homeward Angel, and then after that we will open it up to discussion and participation from the audience and with all 3 of us. All right, so Natalie, please take it away.
Thanks very much. So people may not be familiar with the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. Sorry, are you able to hear me when I'm reading off my screen? Or do I disappear?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. Figured it was better to check this out early. But the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 attacked Philadelphia between August and November of that year, and it's estimated that it killed at least 4,000 people, although that number is probably quite a bit higher. So 8 to 10% of the city's total population. And this was the first outbreak of epidemic disease in the independent United States. Charles Brockden Brown was born in 1771 and 1810, and he's probably the most influential and widely read novelist of the early American Republic, the period basically from the 1780s till about 1820. He was the author of many short stories, poems, essays, and book reviews, but he's largely remembered for his 8 novels, many of which, including Arthur Mervyn, are classified by literary critics as American variants of the Gothic genre that was very popular at that time in England. Brown's novels were set in the cities and the countryside of the East Coast of the United States, particularly Pennsylvania, and therefore they did not feature the crumbling castles and mysterious monasteries that were central to the European Gothic genre. But nonetheless, as you may have seen from the excerpt, they're heavy on brooding atmosphere, strange settings, and enigmatic characters who are rarely who they seem at first to be. And as we can really see these in Arthur Mervyn, which was Brown's 4th novel, which was published in 1799. So I want to speak briefly about how this novel brings up issues of racial relations, of the place in the United States in a wider world, and the extent to which the nation was or was not living up to the promise of its recent founding. Arthur Mervyn is a rather difficult novel to describe. It jumps back and forth in time. Much of it involves Arthur Mervyn recounting the story of his life to a doctor, but then he moves back and forth in time in that narrative, and then there's additional material afterwards. It also has multiple plot lines and a very large cast of characters. Put simply, it depicts the attempts of Mervyn, a young Quaker man who has grown up on a farm near Philadelphia, to make his way in the world, seeking financial security, romantic love, and a sense of himself as an independent American man. In this aspect, it's quite in the tradition of the European Bildungsroman, a literary genre which traces the moral and psychological development of a main character, usually a boy or a young man, from his youth to adulthood. But the presence of such elements as mistaken identities, rumors of buried treasures, abandoned mansions, and characters who cannot easily be identified as either good or evil bring it into the bounds of the Gothic. The section that you've read describes Mervyn, who has left Philadelphia after having a number of various alarming and confusing experiences there. He's gone to the countryside, but he is now returning to the city in order to locate a man named Mr. Wallace. Wallace is the fiancé of a woman called Susan Hadwin, who's the daughter of the man who has offered Mervyn refuge. However, as Mervyn prepares to depart, he hears a rumor that a pestilential disease had begun its destructive progress. The numbers of the sick multiplied beyond all example. The malady was malignant and unsparing. Worse still, Brown writes, terror had exterminated all the sentiments of nature. Wives were deserted by husbands and children by parents. The chambers of disease were deserted and the sick left to die of negligence. None could be found to remove the lifeless bodies. Their remains, suffered to decay by piecemeal, filled the air with deadly exhalations and added tenfold to the devastation. Nonetheless, Mervyn resolves to continue with his errand. He feels that he owes the Hadwin family this much. though his apprehension grows as he gets near the city and encounters many people who have fled and hears their tales of terror. The crowding on the roads delays his progress, so he arrives after nightfall. As he walks down High Street, one of the main thoroughfares of the city, instead of equipages and a throng of passengers, the voice of levity and glee, I found nothing but a dreary solitude. You'll have read how Mervyn describes his progress through this ghostly landscape, all too reminiscent of photographs and videos we've recently seen of cities ranging from New York to Hong Kong to Sydney, almost empty of human occupation. But I'd like to draw your attention to a few aspects. One is the role of African Americans. In 1793, Philadelphia had a large free Black population, and the behavior of these men and women during the epidemic was much debated afterwards. Some observers claimed that Black men and women had been good Samaritans who stayed in the city to care for their employers or other sick white people, while others claimed that they had stayed so that they could loot the riches of the dead and the dying, whether from simple greed or because they resented white supremacy. And in reality, many may have remained in the city neither to help nor to harm the white residents, but because they lacked the funds or transportation that would have permitted them to leave. We might think of the comparison with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005. Physicians of the 1790s believed that people of African descent had a degree of natural immunity to yellow fever, and thus urged them to volunteer as nurses and servants, and many did, not least because the city's Black religious leaders encouraged them to do so, thinking that if they gained a reputation for having helped white people when they were in danger, that would improve their political and economic situation after the city returned to normal. But while people actually born in Africa may have been immune to yellow fever because they'd been exposed to it, African Americans were not, and they died at the same rate as whites in terms of their share of the city's population. In chapter 15, we see our first person of color. He's the driver of a hearse into which two white men are loading a coffin and speculating about whether the man inside had actually taken his last breath before they put him in it. In the next chapter, Mervyn enters the house in which he believes Wallace lives. There he finds the corpse, not of Wallace, but of another man. And he sees in a mirror a figure reflected with one eye, a scar on his cheek, a tawny skin, a form grotesquely misproportioned, brawny as Hercules, and habited in livery, the uniform of a servant. This strange man hits Mervyn over the head and knocks him out. When he regains consciousness, he realizes that he's with the hearse driver and the attendants and another white man. They had found him in the house and thought he was dead. This is the classic Gothic anxiety about being buried alive. But when they realize that he was not dead, the other man tells him that the Black man who had attacked him was the dead man's servant. As that man's death approached, the servant had apparently sent the nurse out to find a coffin. And while he was alone, he took the opportunity to steal his employer's valuables. When he had first entered the dead man's room, Mervyn had noticed a small cabinet, the hinges of which were broken and the lid half raised. Some casual or mercenary attendant had not only contributed to hasten the death of the patient, but has rifled his property and fled. But white servants are also far from blameless. Mervyn finds Mr. Wallace, who has been in the hospital at Bush Hill, and reports that the wretches who are hired at enormous wages to tend the sick and convey away the dead neglect their duty and consume the cordials which are provided for the patients in debauchery and riot. So as Brown had written before, social connections are broken. People give up their ideas of duty and law, and people who are supposed to be acting as nurses and servants, in many cases, whether they are Black or white Philadelphians, take the opportunity to loot the dead and the dying. And for an interesting African-American perspective on the Philadelphia epidemic, you might want to read the title story in the collection called Fever by the African-American writer John Edgar Wideman. Moving on, we also see a lot of anxiety about the relationship of the US and other parts of the world. A fear, as we have today with regards to China, of infection coming in from outside. The new United States was supposed to be a physically and morally healthy nation, and therefore it should not be having these outbreaks of epidemic disease, particularly yellow fever, which was associated with the tropics, with the Caribbean and Africa, and thus with Blackness and slavery. Indeed, a recent book claims that the main vector of the outbreak was a British ship which arrived in Philadelphia from what is now Guinea-Bissau. There was also a lot of concern because in 1793, many refugees from the revolution in Haiti, both white people and their Black slaves, were now living in Philadelphia, and it was feared that they were the source of physical and moral contagion. And in an epidemiological sense, this was probably true because the ships on which they traveled probably carried both the virus and the mosquitoes, which spread it around the city. There were also refugees, mostly aristocrats, from the French Revolution, which had broken out several years earlier. And it's worth keeping in mind that at this time, American political leaders were torn between supporting the revolution, as Thomas Jefferson did, seeing it as a struggle for liberty based on principles like those of the American War for Independence, whereas others, such as John Adams, strongly opposed it, seeing it as a terrifying uprising which threatened property rights and social stability. So there are all of these other infections, political and social rather than medical. But in the medical sphere, yellow fever is particularly frightening because at that time, nobody understood how it was transmitted. Brown, in one of his non-fictional writings, described it as if he was operating by invisible agents. We know not in what quarter is it about to attack us. We fear it as we are terrified by the dark. And just to finish up, we might want to think about the ways in which Brown describes Philadelphia. In 1793, it was the national capital of the United States because Washington, D.C. had not yet been developed. It was the biggest city in the US with around 50,000 inhabitants, and it was also the richest city. But here it's being transformed into a scene of Gothic horror. Philadelphia was already known as the city of brotherly love, but Brown, or Mervyn, recounts, as we've seen, incidents in which people, white and Black, either refused to help others or even actively harm them. The new US, which was really born in Philadelphia, was supposed to be a republic based on the virtue and public spiritedness of its citizens, which is why they supposedly did not need a monarch or an aristocracy to rule over them. But just a decade after the end of the revolution, the outbreak of this epidemic seems to have caused many of them to behave in selfish and even cruel ways. So is this epidemic God's punishment for its inhabitants' abandonment of the simple life and embrace of luxury, based on wealth that in many cases was acquired through theft, speculation, or dishonesty? Some Philadelphians, especially Quakers, claimed that this was so. Others, such as the physician Benjamin Rush, thought the disease was internal to the city. It hadn't come from Haiti or Africa, but instead was the result of the filthy conditions in which the poor inhabitants lived. But this idea was also disturbing. Why were Philadelphians living in such conditions? Were they so lazy and degraded, probably from alcohol, that they did not keep themselves or their homes clean? If so, how could they be considered virtuous citizens of a republic? Or were they forced to live in filth because of their extreme poverty? And if so, why just 10 years after the revolution were some Americans living in the kind of misery that was popularly associated with London, Paris, or other old world cities, and not the supposedly wholesome, egalitarian, post-revolutionary United States? So some things to think about with relation to Arthur Mervyn. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So Paula, will you give us a little introduction of Look Homeward Angel?
Sure. Natalie's presentation was just so marvelous. Mine will be perhaps a little more informal. But to tell you something about Look Homeward Angel, I first have to tell you something about the author, Thomas Wolfe. He's considered to be North Carolina's greatest literary son, and he was a well-known American writer back in the 20s and 30s. He was a contemporary of Faulkner and Hemingway and Fitzgerald. And he actually shared the same editor as Fitzgerald and Hemingway. That was Maxwell Perkins. And if some of you happened to catch a film that came out in 2016, you might have learned something about Thomas Wolfe's life and tragic death. He lived only to the age of 38 and was a prolific writer in the short years of his career. But the film Genius tracked his relationship with Maxwell Perkins, who was like a father to Wolfe, and Perkins helped to edit his early novels and bring them into being. It's a very moving film, and it's a film about writing and editing, which to me is just glorious. Who makes a movie about editing? But it's a very moving film. It starred Jude Law as Thomas Wolfe, and Colin Firth as Maxwell Perkins, Nicole Kidman as Wolfe's love interest. So, you know, if you can find it to stream, it's definitely worth watching. But to know a little bit about Thomas Wolfe, his fiction is very autobiographical, particularly Look Homeward Angel. It's hard to separate fact from fiction because they intertwine so much. And the novel Look Homeward Angel, which was published in 1929, follows the life of Eugene Gant, who was the stand-in for Thomas Wolfe from birth till about the age of 19, as he grows up in a very tumultuous, large mountain family in the fictional town of Altamont, which is really Asheville, North Carolina. The names have been changed a bit, but it's the prose is very rhapsodic, it's very vivid, it's very intense, it has all the emotions of a young person, you know, growing up, coming of age, and it definitely follows Thomas Wolfe's life. The part that is of interest for tonight comes towards the end of this very long novel that has to do with the illness and death of Eugene Gant's brother, Ben, who was in real life Wolfe's brother, Ben Wolfe. At this point in the novel, Eugene has been summoned home from college, which Pulpit Hill, which is the name he uses for Chapel Hill, which is where he went to school. Wolfe himself went to school, but he's been summoned home because his brother has become stricken with the flu, or with pneumonia resulting from the flu. He gives about 18 pages to this illness, which shows the great impact Ben's illness and death had on Thomas Wolfe, the writer. And it's thought to be one of the most vivid clinical pictures of the 1918 flu found in literature. And I think one thing we might look at or talk about later is you know, not only the realistic clinical attributes of illness and death from the flu, but also the impact on the family. Just the dramas that erupt around the deathbed, around the circumstances at home. It's very realistic and moving. And it's probably one of the most moving scenes I think I've encountered in literature. Wolfe also wrote quite a bit about illness throughout the novel in other ways. He was obsessed, I think, with death and illness, maybe because it was such a frequent visitor during these pre-antibiotic days. He wrote about typhoid and pneumonia and tuberculosis and so many diseases. And, for me being a nurse, I'm kind of interested in how writers address those conditions and those illnesses. He wrote about his father's cancer very vividly as well. Uh, and some of the research I did, besides his own family history and the closeness to illness and death, is I think the place where Wolfe grew up certainly mirrored that concern. Some of you may know Asheville is in the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. At the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, it became a mecca for the treatment of tuberculosis. The mountain air was thought to, hasten recovery. And so doctors started coming there to set up practice. Sanitariums were set up, often in boarding houses, and some hospitals that expanded to treat patients who had tuberculosis. And so this awareness of illness, I think, was there from the beginning. And Wolfe himself had a lifelong fear of illness and also of getting tuberculosis, which is what ultimately killed him. He had a latent tuberculosis infection, probably one he'd had for years. He became ill during a trip to the West Coast. He caught the flu, and it created revived a latent tuberculosis infection. And some weeks later, he died at Johns Hopkins Hospital from miliary tuberculosis of the brain. So he did end up catching that which he dreaded so much. But in doing some local research on the flu and its impact on Wolfe, but also on his community, I found some many old newspaper articles from Asheville, and I was struck by how often illness was mentioned in the newspapers and how often it was recorded, whether it was tuberculosis cases or then when the flu struck in that area, how many articles and advertisements there were about flu and flu treatments. Even the Asheville Bootery posted an ad: if you buy our leather boots, it will help prevent the flu. So that, they were touting their shoes as being a way to prevent the flu. There were also ads for laxatives. If you take our laxative, you won't get the flu. Vicks Vapor Rub had many ads. And many of you, I was just talking about Vicks Vapor Rub today with some of my staff in a meeting. I don't know how we got to that subject, but Vicks Vapor Rub really came into its heyday during the 1918 flu pandemic. In the span of 1 year, they went from a sales of $900,000 to $3 million, touting Vicks Vapor Rub as a preventative for the flu. The flu in North Carolina, and again, this would have been part of Wolfe's own experience because he was a student at Chapel Hill during the time. When the flu began in North Carolina, it started on the coast in Wilmington. And if you know anything about the geography of North Carolina, it's kind of a wide state. You go from the coastal areas to the Piedmont to the mountain areas. If you're driving by car, it takes several hours. Well, the flu started in Wilmington, and it started moving westward. And newspapers would record accounts of so many cases have now been reported. And there was great fear. I know Natalie talked about the fear. But people at that time, they didn't have the kind of communications systems, instant news that we have today. They would have to wait for news reports. And so every day there was the flu was moving westward, and it was creating a good bit of fear. By the time it hit Chapel Hill, it took a toll there. This is in the middle part of the state. There were 500 students who were stricken with the flu. And I think they ended up emptying out the campus at some point. But 500 students, were in the infirmary and other places. 3 students died. A nurse who was in the infirmary caring for them died. I mean, doesn't this sound familiar to what our healthcare workers are facing today. A mother who came to care for her son at the infirmary, she got sick and died. Her son lived, but she died. And one of the most chilling aspects to me is the university president at the time, President Graham, died of the flu. He was I think he was about 41. And about 2 months later, his successor, who had been the dean of the College of Liberal Arts, he died. So it took two of their leaders, as well as a few students, the nurse. It was quite had quite an impact on the campus. By that point, Wolfe was back home in Asheville because of his brother, his illness. He got a telegram saying, Ben has pneumonia, come at once, because there were no antibiotics, and it was, greatly feared. It was thought that his brother Ben caught it from one of his sister's children. The sister had been visiting, and he caught it and, suffered with a fever and malaise and not feeling too well, but seemed to get better. And then as he was starting to get better, suddenly took a turn for the worse. So over a span of about 10 days to 2 weeks, his illness and death unfolded. Thomas Wolfe was present at the time of his brother's death. So he witnessed firsthand the impact of the flu on the family, on his brother, and, was able to treat it fictionally with great realism. And I think that's, it's been praised by many writers as being one of the most, many experts as being one of the most, accurate depictions of the flu, the 1918 flu. Trying to think what else to tell you in terms of context. But I think that sets the stage for looking at that scene and what it represents on a personal level, a family level. Even there's some snippets in that part of the novel that suggests that, give clues to the impact on the community. I think the mother at one point says in a message, says, "Oh, it seems to strike the big and strong," which was true. It took those who had probably good immune systems, and their immune systems were overwhelmed or overwhelmed the body in response to the flu. But it was unpredictable, and people lived in great fear. Incidentally, the city of Asheville, because they had been watching the flu march across the state from the coast to the military camps to the university and on towards the west, the doctors and public health officials in Asheville were able to take steps early. They closed down facilities, they shut schools and public gatherings, they closed restaurants. They put a lot of measures in place to prevent the spread of the flu. And so as a result, Asheville didn't suffer as badly as some other parts of the state, but they still had a good number of illnesses and death. They set up emergency soup kitchens for families. They had improvised hospitals at schools and other local facilities for those that were sick. I think in the state of North Carolina, there were, I think, an estimated 20,000 deaths from the flu, which is right now with the COVID, I think we have about 400 deaths, if I'm not mistaken. So the flu took a big toll in the state at that time, and it certainly had an impact on families across there. One of our Wolfe Society members, as a matter of fact, she wrote me recently, her grandfather died during the 1918 flu pandemic. I believe that was, and he was a young man, or not too old. So there's still people who have family stories about it, for sure. I think that's about all I have to say in terms of his context.
Thank you so much, Paula. That's great. So I'd like to just open it up now to open discussion and questions from the audience. Um, uh, I guess I can start if if that's okay with you all. Um, so I was thinking about, as I was reading the passages from both novels. Um, I had always thought of Arthur Mervyn as the Gothic novel, and Le Comord Angel as the Bildungsroman, because you kind of follow the arc of Le Comord Angel through you follow the narrative arc of Le Comord Angel through the perspective of Eugene Gant mostly, right? Um, some of the earlier chapters that I was able to kind of skim through have these really like beautiful passages. It's hard to describe them. They're somewhere in between like free and direct discourse and stream of consciousness. And they're focalized through like Eugene as a toddler, learning, learning the smell of his house and of the different people that he lives with, and learning what language is, and really being introduced to the world of using words and figuring out how to express himself, and suddenly he can, and once he's able to talk, all this whole new world opens to him. And then there's, the kind of middle part about his going to school, and about his sort of getting in trouble. Um, and then a brother who's Ben's twin dies in the family, and that affects him quite a lot. And then, toward the end, we have Ben's death. And so I've always thought of, Le Comord Angel as the uh, Bildungsroman, and then the Charles Brockden Brown as the Gothic, because there's so many Gothic passages. Earlier, before we started our session, Natalie was talking about the extremely convoluted plot of Arthur Mervyn, and much of it seems not really that relevant to the action that's going on with the main characters. But then, there are, but the scenes that we read for today in Le Comord Angel, I kind of went back and looked through them, and I found these really amazing Gothic passages. And it seemed like Thomas Wolfe was also drawing on this earlier kind of American novelistic tradition of using the Gothic to describe the so almost like supernatural qualities of seeing somebody in death. So if it's okay, I'll just read a couple of these passages, because I think they're so arresting. And these are passages that come from chapter 35, when he's describing Ben, who's already very, very ill, and he's lying in bed, and he says, Ben's long, thin body lay 3/4 covered by the bedding. Its gaunt outline was bitterly twisted below the covers in an attitude of struggle and torture. It seemed not to belong to him. It was somehow distorted and detached, as if it belonged to a beheaded criminal. And the sallow yellow of his face had turned gray. Out of this granite tint of death, lit by 2 red flags of fever, the stiff black furs of a 3-day beard was growing. The beard was somehow horrible. It recalled the corrupt vitality of hair, which can grow from a rotting corpse. And Ben's thin lips were lifted in a constant grimace of torture and strangulation about his white, somehow dead-looking teeth, as inch by inch he gasped a thread of air into his lungs. And that's one of those, passages that you read, and you feel like you are there, and you see Ben, and the horror is so present, just like it is in the passages where Arthur Mervyn is describing the people that he's seeing, like on the carts as he's going into Philadelphia. And it just made me think that both of these authors are drawing on both of these novelistic traditions, the Gothic and the Bildungsroman, to tell the story of illness. And I was wondering what you both thought about these two genres in particular. Or is there something about the Gothic and something about the Bildungsroman that both lend themselves to being used to tell stories of illness? Is there something that is particularly useful about them in helping us to process, pandemics or people dying or these things that we don't normally come across?
I would say I'll talk about the Bildungsroman aspect, and because I know the autobiographical underpinnings of Wolfe's fiction and the tremendous impression that the death of his older brother Grover, who died from typhoid fever when Wolfe was 4, and then when Grover's twin Ben died, Wolfe would have been 18, so still a young person. And I think it reminds us of the impact on children and young people of these cataclysmic events, these life events, whether it's the illness of a loved one, the death of a loved one. It's kind of becomes frozen in time in a way, and it. When I teach The Lost Boy, which is the novella about the death of Grover, the other twin, and my students really connect with that because they're close in age to, they're 18 to 20 something, and some of them have lost loved ones, and they connect with this grief and sense of loss. I remember one student talking about the death of a brother and how it forever changed her family and changed her, and reading the novella helped her understand the sense of being frozen in time with grief that her parents had experienced. And the same for other students. I think they connect. That's a life when a young person loses a loved one, it changes them profoundly, or it impacts. They remember it, and I think in writing a novel of development, that's going to be there. That's one of those key life events. If one has experienced it, it's going to show up, and it's part of the trajectory of that person's life from there on. And certainly it was for Wolfe as a person and also as a writer. And for his character Eugene, that the death of Ben, changed everything. And the Gothic aspects, as you were reading that passage, I kept thinking, oh, I never thought of that, but it sounds like Poe.
Yeah, exactly.
A Poe story. Those very vivid descriptions. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go back and read Poe and compare this and see, because you're right, that Gothic element is certainly there.
And I think what connects the Bildungsroman and the Gothic, is the idea, of the uncanny, of something that that suddenly is transformed in a really frightening way. So in Look Homeward, Angel, Ben is the beloved brother, who Eugene has known all his life, but suddenly he's turned into this suffering, dying creature. And as much as he is the loved brother, he's also this kind of grotesque monster in the bed. And as much as, Eugene and the family are, horrified at the impending death of their loved one, he's also kind of disgusting to them. This isn't a pretty illness. You get lots of things in the 19th century about, starving poets and beautiful girls who have, wasting diseases, but it just makes them more beautiful. They just get paler and thinner and more heavy with shadowed eyes, and they die very prettily. But this is not a pretty death. It's obviously an incredibly painful death, and it makes you ugly. And yellow fever is the same way. So people who had been rich or beautiful or at least young and strapping and healthy, become these, blackened, corpses. And, when Arthur Mervyn goes in the house and he thinks it's Wallace's house and he finds this dead man, he finds the corpse. I mean, this is somebody he's never seen before. He realizes quickly it's not Wallace, it's somebody else that he doesn't know. But still, even though he has no emotional investment in this person, he's horrified to think, look what this, this is clearly a pretty wealthy man. He lives in this big house, he's got servants, but now he's this hideous thing. And there's that, kind of grotesque joke when he sees the hearse driver and the two hearse attendants who have just carried out another coffin. And I think that guy, he was definitely dying. They haven't just killed a healthy guy and put him in a coffin. But it was like, well, he was taking his last breath or two. He was going to be gone in 2 minutes anyway. But, was he actually alive when they put him in the coffin? So there is this sense of, places and, for Eugene, and the fact that this death is occurring at home. So forever, as long as he lives in that house or visits his parents in that house, there's going to be that bedroom where Ben died. Even if you repaint it and get new furniture, is he ever going to be able to see it as anything other than Ben's deathbed? And whereas, Mervyn, goes from the countryside to Philadelphia the first time, and he thinks Philadelphia is so glorious and glamorous and exciting with bright lights and sexy women and big shops and mansions and all this stuff going on. But now, it's the same city that he had been in a few months ago, but it's as if, the shadow of death has fallen over it. All the houses are dark. There's nobody out on the streets. The taverns are locked up rather than having sounds of music and laughter. And, it's something that, was once homely or loved or exciting and now has transformed. So I think that's how you link the two genres.
If I could ask a question and perhaps pave the way for people in the online audience to submit questions of their own. Natalie, at the risk of making a big deal out of something you said very quickly, but you talked about the element of the uncanny. I think it's true that we only use the word uncanny for things that have a mysterious eloquence, right? A mysterious eloquence. And as I listen to you, it sounds like what's uncanny in Arthur Mervyn is the sense that the disease is deserved. It's deserved by the people who suffer, and this is what troubles them. On the other hand, as I listen to your discussion of Look Homeward Angel, Paula, you don't hint that Wolfe is in any way suggesting the suffering is deserved, right? As I listen to you, it sounds like the suffering could have been caused by a death in childbirth. It could have been caused by any number of things. So I gather that in Wolfe's novel, you would not say the death is uncanny, would you?
No, I wouldn't. I don't think I would. They still didn't know a lot about the flu and death from the flu, but they had a sense of, what they needed to do to halt it, much like the steps we're taking today, social distancing and, keeping people apart. But I think with the yellow fever, from what I've read, that would be more what you're saying, that this sense of, did they deserve it or what did they do to get it? I think with the flu, it's more of being a victim.
Is Wolfe's novel morally uncomplicated?
I think in regard to the flu, I think it probably is. Now there's other parts of the novel where there's, other issues of morality that I think are complicated for him, for the character of Eugene. But I think with the flu, the complications come in with the family dynamics and how family members interact with each other during Ben's illness. I don't think I think it's what's going on around him where those moral questions come in, and the blame game. Like, for example, one of the siblings blames the mother because she was so stingy. She delayed in sending for medical help for Ben. And so there's blame there. Also, someone makes the comment, well, if he hadn't been here in this horrible drafty house, a boarding house, he wouldn't have gotten sick. So it's not so much on Ben as it is on other family members. And then there's the father who's, while his son is dying, he's going, woe is me, and trying it, really, I think, worrying about his own future and death, which comes actually not too much longer, past that. But I think the moral complications are are within the family dynamics. Ben is just kind of the catalyst.
Okay, thank you.
Could I chime in on that? What I think makes the situation in Arthur Mervyn complicated is it's not so much that the individual people who get yellow fever deserved it, because even little children get it, and presumably little children are sinless. But it's the nation that deserves it. And why does it deserve it? Because it's already fallen away from what were supposed to be the revolutionary ideals. The city is full of poor slum dwellers, or the greed of wealthy merchants has encouraged too much engagement with the West Indies and Africa. And that has brought the disease in. Or there are these Haitian refugees who are slaveholders. And of course, the United States is full of slaveholders, but those from Haiti were considered to be much more cruel, which is supposedly why their slaves rebelled. And even the slaves that the Haitian slave owners bring with them, of course, they were the supposedly loyal slaves who didn't rebel against the people who owned them. But still, there's a sense that they're not like normal African-American slaves. They're wild people who came from Africa. They probably practice voodoo. And then there's, aristocrats that ran from the French Revolution. And is the French Revolution good or is it bad? Are these pitiful victims running away from the terror, or are they the monsters that oppressed the French poor and caused them to have a revolution? So there's the sense that America, even by 1793, has lost its way. And this is often reflected in Mervyn's character. Mervyn isn't a bad guy. He's not a cruel person, but he's a bit of a wastrel. I mean, he's naive, but even being beyond naivete, he's easily seduced into luxury. He's willing to do crooked things because influential people tell him that he ought to. He's not, I mean, he's pure in the sense that he mostly does things that are not good out of naivete. But again, is that good? If he represents the US, the fresh-faced youth from the country, well, the US isn't doing too well either then. So, there is just this sense that this is a society that is not in a good state. And therefore, the yellow fever was, it was not necessarily brought on by an individual, whereas a good man will not get it and a bad man will, but it's brought on by the sins of the nation in general.
Thank you.
Natalie, I don't know if you mentioned this, but the name yellow fever, and when I read the passages, from Arthur Mervyn, I could, the descriptions of the illness and the people, the disease is caused by a virus transmitted by mosquitoes, and in its worst form causes organ failure and damage, and the jaundice that results from the liver being, attacked. And then just, some cases or some transmissions or outbreaks were far worse than others in terms of the effects on individuals. But that novel really is vivid. It's almost, and there's kind of a detachment in the reporting of it. I was so struck by the vivid pictures of those who had the disease. Oh my goodness.
Well, it really left a scar on the American psyche. I mean, obviously on Philadelphia, because so many people had lost people that they knew, but even on places that were very far away. Because, I mean, for a big city like that to lose 10% of its population, and it's only over a period of 3 months. It goes pretty quickly considering the primitive state of medicine at that time. But I think there's a day in October 1793 when approximately 750 people die. which, for a city of only 50,000, I mean, that's just an enormous number going. And of course, the hospitals can't cope. I mean, not that going to the hospital was necessarily going to save you, except that, there would be people there supposedly to treat you, although, the few doctors were overwhelmed and they didn't know where it was coming from either. And, as Mervyn says, some of the people who were hired to be hospital attendants, just got drunk on the medicines and, stole the patient's belongings. So, it was probably better than dying completely by yourself, but not a lot. But, it is a thing, I mean, that people think about, and, people generations later, they do know about it. I mean, obviously it didn't have the effect that influenza did because it's localized. So, if you didn't live in or around Philadelphia, it probably didn't directly affect you. It's not something that becomes part of the national history, but it really, coming so soon and, at a time when the US is really kind of struggling. There have been popular uprisings against national authority. There's the question of whether or not the Americans should be backing the French Revolution. There's the fear that the Haitian Revolution is going to spread to American slaves. And, the knowledge that George Washington is an old man. And not only does he not want to be president forever, he can't because he's elderly and not in the greatest shape. So, what's going to happen when the father of his country goes? So it's an apprehensive time.
Yes.
If I could, Bob Powell would like to join the discussion. Bob, are you there? And Bob, you'll need to unmic your computer.
There. Is that?
That's
I
it.
online?
I hear you.
Yep.
Okay. Hi, Paula. A couple of comments. Question that was raised about, did Ben kind of earn or deserve somehow his death? There's that passage in there where Coker, the doctor, is asked, when did you know he was going to die? And Coker's answer was, about 10 years before, when I saw him at 3 a.m. with a donut in one hand and a cigarette in the other in the diner.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of thing that plays along there.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to follow up on, Paula, was your comment about young people experiencing death. And with Wolfe being about 18 or so when this happened, there's that wonderful last part of the chapter where he says, one can believe in the nothingness of life, one can believe in the nothingness of death, or death and life, or death, life after death, but can anyone believe in the nothingness of Ben? As an 18-year-old or younger, the idea of someone of life and death, those are really abstractions. Ben is his universe, and throughout the whole life, Ben is the one member of the family who provided a kind of constant support system for Eugene. And so that was the thought. And then the last time, I had a quick question, Paula. He came back not because Chapel Hill shut down, but because of Ben.
Right.
Any idea how long he stayed back because of Chapel Hill?
I'd have to look into that. I don't, I think I've got a source where I can find that information about, the timeline between the university being, hit so hard, the dates there. But I think he was probably gone for a good while. And then I know the presidents died one in November and one in January. So I think when Wolfe was home when his brother was ill was probably the worst part at Chapel Hill as well.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, I was also thinking, oh, I'm sorry, Phil. I was also thinking about that passage that Bob brought up, and thinking about Ben's death occurring almost as a surprise to everybody in the family, because I think that when they find out about, or when Eugene is called home by his mother, the family is expecting someone to die, but it's not Ben. they're expecting the father to die, because he has had, I think is it prostate cancer, for several chapters. And and so the family is sort of waiting around to hear when the father is going to really start going downhill. And then I think one of the sisters says something like, I can't believe it. It's so unfair that, now that we have this death and that we have somebody dying in the family, it's Ben. And none of us ever expected it to be Ben. And so that sort of adds to that element of surprise, I think adds to all the siblings feeling that this is a really unfair event. Like Ben wasn't the one that was supposed to go.
And he would have been like 26. And he also was getting better. He had the flu and was getting better. And then suddenly, as that 1918 flu would do, it would, suddenly turn and people would succumb, very quickly. There was an estimated 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide from the 1918 flu. I think in the United States, talking to what Natalie was saying about the numbers, this was so global. And in the United States, I think there were over maybe 675,000 deaths from the flu in that year and a half of the sweep of that pandemic. It had 3 seasons, the spring, the fall, then the spring again. And so, it was a very global, not localized. I mean, it certainly was local for many communities and cities, but it, was part of this very global disaster that took place. And yet in Wolfe's novel, we get the very personal, the most intimate of experiences of the flu. And the passage that, Bob referenced and that you commented on too, Vivian, to me is just, one of the most heartbreaking and moving. Who can believe in the nothingness of Ben? I mean, that, just shows this disbelief. My favorite, one of my favorite lines from from the novel is when the doctor tells the sister, when she says, "Can't you do anything more for him?" And Dr. Coker says, "We can't turn back to the hours when our lungs were sound, our blood hot, our bodies young. We are a flash of fire, a brain, a heart, spirit." And it just, speaks to the our temporary human condition, and also the march of time. We can't turn back the clock. But I love that, we are a flash of fire, which is really what all of us are. We're a flash of fire in the universe in a way.
I have 2 comments from audience members. First of all, a question, Natalie, for you from Pat Cornett. Pat asked, were there other serious outbreaks of yellow fever at this time in the US, or is the Philadelphia outbreak an isolated event?
In 1793, it's an isolated event. And as I mentioned that recent book, which is called, I believe it's called Ship of Death by Billy Smith, which claims that a British ship that had been in West Africa and then gone to Philadelphia was the vector. But yellow fever was a serious problem throughout the 19th century. New Orleans in particular, every couple of years there would be a massive outbreak of yellow fever, usually in the summer and the early autumn. People sometimes refer to New Orleans at the time as the Kingdom of Death. Yellow fever is really a tropical disease. So it was quite unusual that there would be an outbreak as far north as Philadelphia. But it was very common in Western Africa. It was not at all uncommon in the Caribbean. And as I said, in New Orleans, really, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, huge numbers of people die. Well, probably small numbers probably every year, but every couple of years, very large numbers. And, there's that same sense of the city turning into a necropolis.
Green Stavish would like to enter the discussion.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for all of this. I never knew about Arthur Mervyn, and Look Homeward Angel is one of my all-time favorite books. And somewhere in the comments that Vivian made about the family waiting and how unexpected it was. And I always forget the line, and I don't have my book with me, but afterwards, Eugene says that it's something like, we waited at the door or we waited at the window for death, and he came in through the basement. And it's this idea of death as this character. But the comment I wanted to make was that, so this is our 4th week of plague literature, which is filled with, especially tonight, despair, no humor, ugly, pestilence, and I'm looking for where the hope is. One of the things I'm reading now, which is actually calming me, is The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson. And it starts the day that Churchill becomes Prime Minister of England. And it goes through the Battle of Britain and the bombings and everything, and the resilience of people. And that's what I'm looking for. So today I picked up one of my favorite books of plague literature, which is Albert Camus' The Plague, which is an allegory of Vichy France and the rats that invade this country, which are really the Nazis. And the protagonist ends the book with this comment: what we learn in a time of pestilence is that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. And my question is, in either of the books that we're discussing tonight, is there this kind of conclusion of hope, of resilience, of something that will help us in 2020 to respond to a similar crisis?
You know, that is such a great observation. And I was thinking about the ending of Look Homeward, Angel. Towards the end of the novel, Eugene encounters Ben's ghost on the steps of his father's stone cutting shop. And he has this conversation with Ben. And, you know, Ben has given him advice. You know, Eugene is full of great despair, you know, just like you said, great despair, great sense of loss. And he's so shocked and surprised to see Ben there. And Ben makes the comment, and I'd have to turn to the last pages. Maybe Bob has his book handy. But, you know, Ben tells Eugene, you are your own world. You know, kind of like you can do this, that you are your own world. You can create your path, your destiny, your future, you know, go forward. And to me, that's sort of like a blessing from, you know, from the lost brother to the brother who remains behind, to help him move past this horrible loss and death. But you know, maybe it's a message to all of us. You know, we create, you know, we do have a way of shaping our worlds and realities, and it's not easy, but I think the human spirit is certainly capable of doing that. And also our human knowledge about what to do to cope. I know I'm chair of a large department of many faculty and staff and a few hundred students. And I've seen such a range of responses to this pandemic in terms of, you know, great despair, great depression, anxiety, but also others who were like, no, we can do this. And this is what we need to do. And, you know, kind of a pragmatism. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, you know, if there's hope, it's like we are our own world. And we can do it and you know, have a hand in this. So no, I think there's an element of hope at the end.
Vivian, go ahead, Natalie. Sorry.
With Arthur, I mean, you know, because this is a late 18th century novel, it doesn't really deal with interiority. I mean, Arthur Mervyn, you know, I mean, it's narrated in the first person. But Mervyn doesn't really, I mean, it's just sort of a record of this happened and then I did that, and then that happened and I did that. So he basically just says, well, there was an outbreak of epidemic disease. It was really bad. Lots of people died. Some people behaved well, but other people behaved really badly. And then it's just like, oh yeah, and then it ended, and then things kind of went back to normal. So it doesn't seem very scarring to him. I mean, he's seen all these dreadful things, but then he's just like, yeah, well, eventually it just faded away. So I suppose there's a sort of hope in that. I mean, he is supposed to be a very callow young man. And, you know, he is largely reactive. And, you know, in the novel, he is not very reflective either about himself or about other people or things that he's seen. But in his life, things get better. You know, he goes back to the country. And then after lots of machinations, he ends up back in the city. And the city is reviving. And, you know, the taverns are open and the shops and the streets are full of people. It's like it was when he first came there. And he gets his happy ending because in a rather weird twist. I mean, he's had all these weird fascinations with these strange women, some of whom turn out to be prostitutes or long lost daughters of rich men. But then he meets this woman, and initially he says, basically, she's a really nice woman and she's smart, but God, she's really ugly. But then weirdly, he falls in love with her. She happens to be very rich. She falls in love with him too. So they get married and they live happily ever after on her money, as far as we know. So he gets a happy ending, even though he's not really the perfect guy. And incidentally, the woman he marries, whose name is Aksa, is, as far as I know, the first literary character in American fiction who is specifically described as Jewish. So he marries a rich Jewish woman and lives in her mansion, and presumably life is good. So there is a sense of, well, life goes on, and Philadelphia turned into this necropolis, but then a few months later, you know, things went back to normal. So I think there is a certain just idea of, well, things happen, and well, eventually they aren't like that anymore and they get better. So there's a, you know, it's not a very emotional or insightful or soul-searching kind of a message, but that wasn't really what late 18th century novels did. So there's the sense of, it was just one more thing that happened in Arthur Mervyn's life when he was a young man before he settled down with his rich wife.
If I could add, it's also not true that so far the readings in our symposium have been just a record of uninterrupted bleakness and despair. Boccaccio's Decameron, right, is, I think, shows the Dionysian reaction to horror. There's a Dionysian reaction which is exuberantly full of life. Now, some commentators who see the Dionysian reaction in action will describe it as symptomatic of despair, emotional unraveling, et cetera, et cetera. But it's hard to describe the Decameron that way. The Decameron is full of humor and hilarity and exuberance. Optimism. So for whatever it's worth, Corinne, that's the exception to what might otherwise be the trend in this series of readings.
Right. No, I was just, it was tonight, it was so bleak. And that's why I wanted to see if we could just pull out a little bit of, it's not even hope, it's resilience.
And I think that's how Look Homeward Angel ends, is that resilience, because at the very end, you know, when Eugene is ending this encounter, I mean, he's, you know, the language, you know, Ben says, this is life, you've been nowhere, and then he tells to Eugene, there is one voyage, the first, the last, the only one. And so it's like he's given permission to Eugene to move on with his life. And then at the end, the very last words of the novel, yet as he stood for the last time by the angels of his father's porch, it seemed as if the square already were far and lost, or should I say, he was like a man who stands upon a hill upon the town, above the town he has left, yet does not say the town is near, but turns his eyes upon the distant soaring ranges. To me, that's, you know, that looking upward, you know, looking beyond is a forward moving image, and I think it's hopeful. You, Phil, you mentioned about humor. There's a lot of humor in Look Homeward Angel, in different scenes and different escapades that Eugene finds himself in, and there's even a bit of humor in following the death of Ben, when after he's died, the family goes into the kitchen. Eugene is hungry, wants something to eat. Again, life goes on, and there's talk about the mother's coffee, and one of the siblings says, well, at least Ben won't have to drink her coffee anymore, which is, and of course it makes the mother cry, but it is kind of a funny line, that, well, he's dead, he's going to have to drink her coffee, her bad coffee.
Bob Powell would like to jump in again.
Actually, I was going to recite the last paragraph that Paul already brought up, but Ben's death is the defining tragedy of the book. And so Wolfe could emotionally have just stayed in that town.
Yep.
And so he looked at the town, and not like it's near, but I'm going to look toward those soaring mountain ranges. And
Yeah.
so it's all about taking the next step forward.
And Wolfe did that. I mean, he didn't do that. He became a world citizen. He, went to Harvard, New York, to Europe. I mean, he did go to those distant ranges. So it is of resilience, personally and literarily.
And Arthur Mervyn, as I said, ends the same way. He meets this woman, he falls in love with her, decides she's actually not that ugly, and she's rich, and they get married. And I mean, they don't literally he doesn't literally describe lots of babies, but the presumption is that's what's going to happen. So he's moved on too.
If I could say, it seems to me as I listen to the panel that we've made an incongruous pairing of books tonight. It sounds like these are really two dissimilar books, quite dissimilar books. And so it seems to me that has to raise the question of literary representations of suffering, of extreme suffering. No one has spoken of, no one has claimed that such things defy description. No one has said that suffering of this magnitude enters the realm of the ineffable, right? I don't think anyone has said that in the whole symposium, the whole series. It sounds like instead everyone thinks that plagues are really interesting material for literature, right? And in fact, if I understand you, Paula, your great salute to Wolfe is the achievement of his empathy.
And I think that's in the the up close and personal experience of life, and his awareness, his empathy for those. I mean, and that surfaces throughout the novel, and also in his other works. I'm going to point back to The Lost Boy. I mean, oh my gosh, the expression of human empathy in that novella is just utterly profound. And if it doesn't resonate with the reader, the sense of loss and awareness of human tragedy and the effect on the individual, whether it's a young child, the mother, a sister, a sibling, that empathy is so much part of Wolfe's strength. And I would recommend that to the audience. If it's not as long as Look Homeward Angel, it's only about 90 some pages, but it's so exquisitely written and so moving in its treatment of family loss. The language itself will carry you away. That's the transcendent part for me in Wolfe is his language. It sweeps us along and makes the spirit soar. The mind is definitely stimulated, but it's the language that's so uplifting.
Whereas Brockden Brown, he wants to scare you. He wants to say, imagine you're walking in the dark through the city. Just a few months ago, it was a huge, bustling, exciting, scary, noisy city where, anything could happen. But now, it's the valley of the shadow. And what do you hear, the creak of the hearse, the moans of the dying. But of course, the big difference is, I mean, Brockden Brown did live through the yellow fever, but I don't know that he lost anyone he loved to it. And this is generalized death. We see dead people, we see some bodies, but they're not of any of the main characters. And I mean, first of all, there's no character that would be as developed as something in Wolfe.
Right.
But also, I mean, even, it's just generalized, lots of dead people. And so, very much comes out of the Gothic, the idea of, isn't that scary? So in the European Gothic is, wouldn't it be scary if you were an innocent young girl and you ended up living in a creepy castle with a sinister man? Ooh, wouldn't that be really scary? This is pretty much the same thing, except it is historically accurate that, yes, Philadelphia did have this outbreak in 1793, and yes, yellow fever is real, whereas maybe ghosts and monsters aren't real. But he's not really trying to get you to empathize with the suffering of the dying or the people that have lost their loved ones. He's really getting you to say, ooh, isn't that super creepy? And I think that's why, it reads very well as creepy literature. It is very cinematic. You could easily adapt at least that part of Arthur Mervyn, for a film. But you're not very emotionally engaged because the characters are so flat anyway, and even the main ones don't die. It's just a general sense. So it's not meant to make you feel. I mean, even though I only read that bit of Like Homeward Angel that you set out, Paula, but even though I hadn't really engaged with the characters, it's very palpable. This is a man. He's got brothers, sisters, parents, loved ones, and he's going to be dead soon. And yes, millions of people will be dead, but this is Ben.
Yeah.
And, to this family, it doesn't matter if Ben is the only one in the whole world who dies or if hundreds of millions do. This is about their suffering, whereas it's very different in Arthur Mervyn, and it really is more like, well, we've had the buried treasure, we've had the creepy mansion, we've had that guy, and, is he good or evil? Does he want to help Arthur Mervyn, or is he setting him up to take the blame for a crime? That woman, is she an innocent led astray, or is she an evil, conniving woman who wants to bring Arthur down? So we just have one more thing. We can have, a creepy Death City. So the intents are quite different.
There's a comment from Pat Cornett. Pat says, disasters of all types, not just plagues, are always great subjects for writers, especially novelists. Example, war, earthquakes, natural disasters, etc. It gives the writer an opportunity to depict characters at exceptional moments and show them at their best or worst. It creates great drama.
I would definitely agree. I mean, it doesn't in Arthur Mervyn because that's from really a different era of writing when, the way emotion was portrayed was a bit different. But, certainly, I think, whether you're reading a novel about prisoners of war or people who were the victims of a hurricane, the question would be, well, what would I do if I were there? Would I be the person that risked my life to help other people? Or would I be the person who, just broke down and couldn't cope at all? Would I be the person who ended up, collaborating just to save myself? So any of those can really become, whether it's, prisoner of war camp, a concentration camp, or, people living, even a situation like the TV show Lost, it's all, well, which person would I be? You want to think, I'd be the person that, did the best I could and helped others, even if I risked my own life. But, sometimes you think, well, would I be the person who would do anything to save myself? Or worse still, would I just be the person who sort of sat in the corner and whimpered a lot?
Natalie, can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
The 18th century is when the novel is being developed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think Brown felt he was working from any models, or was this experimental?
That's a really good question. I mean, certainly he was a widely read man. I'm sure that he had read many of the novels that from the mid 18th century onwards. I'm sure he'd read the epistolary novels and he'd read the Gothic novels. I think what he's often trying to do is figure out what is an American novel. I mean, there hadn't really been any before him. I mean, we really don't have, we have some plays from before Revolution, and we have captivity narratives, which sometimes are heavily fictionalized, but we don't really have novels in America before about the 1780s. So is there something to be the American novel? It's going to be written in English, but is it just the English novel, or is there something specific about the American setting and American national character and what kind of people that Americans are? So I think he doesn't necessarily see himself playing with format, but he definitely is very self-consciously, I mean, he's part of this kind of group of New York intellectuals, who meet up together. They're kind of a literary clique, and they are very much trying to figure out, what is our national culture going to be? Maybe, sure, Shakespeare and, Pope and, Milton are our literary antecedents because they wrote in English, but we aren't English, or at least we aren't English anymore. So what is our national literature going to be about? And, in his case, he's translating both, the Gothic genre and also that kind of emerging Bildungsroman genre, and saying, well, what would it be like if you moved that setting over to America and all the people in it were Americans? And also you brought in, as many of his novels do, Native Americans, African Americans, people who don't exist or don't exist in large numbers in Europe. So how are we going to make America a literary place?
Yeah,
And I would,
it seems to me that Wolfe is also trying to do something similar, right? Maybe that's where Paula was going too.
absolutely, and I was going to say, Wolfe is the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Because that was one of his big concerns too, was the sense of America, and what his role as an artist and a writer is in connection to that culture, and that surfaces throughout all of his novels. This happens to be his first novel, so it's just beginning to get underway. But he had a great awareness of society, of culture, of what it means to be a writer. He's writing at the same time as Faulkner and Hemingway and Fitzgerald. Oh my goodness, what company to be in. This probably, my area of specialty is 20th century American literature. And I think of the 1920s as being, the most incredible decade in American literature, period, because of the greatness that, was unleashed then. And Wolfe is part of that. So I would say Wolfe would be an answer to the question Natalie just posed. And yet he has his literary antecedents, the 19th century writers, the Romantics. He's been linked to Whitman in terms of his use of prose and imagery, and Whitman too is this great sense of America. And I think Wolfe certainly, took that a step further as well.
We're just about out of time.
Oh, sorry, Phil.
No,
I
go
was
ahead.
thinking too that they're both of these novels are feel very American to me. I when I was doing my PhD, I studied British fiction, so both of these novels feel very American to me, in their portrayal of particular types of people that you don't encounter in British novels or non-American novels. So like certainly African Americans, right? And this like the people who are in service to the family that Arthur Mervyn is sort of working for. And then in Look Homeward Angel, you have depictions of Southern rural people, and all of the sort of family troubles that they have, right? Wolfe is not shy about depicting like family abuse, alcoholism, neglect. All of these things that we think about, like I associate that with Faulkner and this very American novelistic tradition of sort of exposing all of the different parts of American life, whether they be good or bad, or all of the different people that play a role in American life. So for me, both of these novels feel very, very American.
The essential last thing, shout out to Natalie's mother, Judy Zashek, who's in the audience. Hello, Mrs. Zashek. Thanks for joining us. Okay, I think that wraps us up for tonight. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian and Natalie.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks to everyone. Thanks for Phil for putting this together, for Vivian and Paula for making it happen, to Scott for doing the tech stuff.
And for the audience for being here.
Yes, and for having such interesting things to say.
Yep. Great. Hope to see you all next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.